Hi, welcome to Bookmark. I'm your host, Don Noble. Today's guest is Georgia fiction writer Taylor Brown. Brown is the author of 5 novels and a book of stories. His latest, Wing Walkers, describes the exploits of daring aerial acrobats in the 1920s and 30s. I spoke with Taylor Brown in Studio UA in the Digital Media Center on the campus of the University of Alabama. Taylor, I'm very grateful you could stop in here today. You're having a very busy time. You're on tour with the new book, Wing Walkers. How many cities are you visiting?
I think about 12 or 13 in total,
Uh-huh.
and I've done about 8 so far.
Where were you yesterday?
Yesterday I was in Jackson at one of my favorite stores, Lemuria Books.
Absolutely. And where will you be tomorrow?
Tomorrow I'm going to be in Auburn at Auburn Oil Booksellers.
And then, are you going down to Fairhope?
I did already.
Oh,
I
you've
kind of did
been.
a loop down and did Fairhope and then New Orleans and then came up.
Uh-huh.
So I've been coming up north.
Well, that is the Southern Book Tour, and it works. I mean, there are a lot of readers on that book tour. You've not been on the show before, so let's hear a little bit about you. I know a couple of things. I know that you're a son of the Georgia coast and that you went to UGA. Where did you grow up in high school and so on?
So I grew up on St. Simon's Island, about equidistant between Brunswick and, between Savannah and Jacksonville, Florida. And I went to school at the public high school there, Glenn Academy. And then I went to the University of Georgia, English major. And that's really where I found my love of, literature, I think.
I want to go back to that, of course, but you didn't mess around with graduate school at all, did you?
I did. I started looking at schools, at different programs, fairly seriously, started studying for the GRE because a lot of the programs require that. And then I started to get some things published and won this Montana Prize in Fiction, and things were just rolling. And also some life changes happened that would have made it tough to go back to school, and so I just kept rolling with it.
Well, now you have 6 books. So if you want to, you can go someplace and give out MFAs in fiction writing to other people who think they need one. I know a good deal of today I want to talk about Wing Walkers because I do think it's sensational. And it is partly about Faulkner. And I don't want to pass up the opportunity for you to say a nice thing about your English professor. Mm-hmm. You studied Faulkner at the University of Georgia with
Dr. Hubert McAlexander, who really helped put me on the path that I found myself. Hubert is from Holly Springs, Mississippi. He was a force in the classroom like I've never seen. I've never experienced someone who could seemingly draw out of students things that they didn't even realize that they knew until the moment he put them on the spot. It was like lightning crackling around the classroom.
That's wonderful. And I always want to promote the idea that professors of American literature are really, really important people. I've done my best with that. So, as an undergraduate, obviously Faulkner, and of course Flannery O'Connor, but you have a few reading influences in your early life that are not exactly mainstream. One is Harry Crews, and another, and I did not need to be told this, I promise you, there's a short story about cannibalism, mm-hmm. which is pure Cormac McCarthy, and then there's certain little moments that snap, crackle, and pop of Harry Crews's kind of violence, mm-hmm. and so on. But those, the Faulkner, Cormac McCarthy, Harry Crews, Flannery O'Connor.
Absolutely.
In a sense, I know this. You could write a dissertation on answering the question, but you are a Southern writer, and these are Southern writers who have played a part in shaping your aesthetic. What is it, you think, finally, about Southern literature, even your own, that makes it different from Ohio, but not Montana necessarily?
Mm-hmm. I think that there's the emphasis on the rural, the whole, the tension of agricultural versus industrial and all that seemed a little newer and like there was more about that culture. I think there's something about the speech patterns and the way people talk and the culture of the story, the culture of storytelling, that is still very much alive. You know, I think most of us know folks that just are these incredible storytellers, and I'm not sure that that is as revered everywhere else as it is here. That deep sense of history, of the land. It's hard to put your finger on one thing, right. You know, but certainly there do seem, you know, it seems that a lot of my other favorite writers are the Western writers. So it is interesting that there's some parallel there. And
well, it is rural. It is rough. There's an element of violence in even in Zane Grey, people are shooting each other.
Right.
You know. After college, having wisely, I think, decided not to go to graduate school, I see that you worked here and there. What were you doing in South America? Where else? Were you in New Orleans? Where else were you?
I was in, I graduated in 2005 from the University of Georgia. I was an English major. I originally thought that I was going to go back to school and become a literature professor. I was going to take the GRE and pursue a PhD in literature, but I started working on my first novel. I'd really started working on my first short stories when I was, you know, toward the end of my undergraduate career. And I'd read Hemingway's A Movable Feast, and I had this idea of 1920s Paris, and I thought, where could I go today that is similarly that I could live cheaply and people cared about art, cared about culture, and I could kind of keep working on this novel. And after some research, I decided that Argentina was the place. I sold my car and I moved myself to Argentina to teach English as a second language and to write at the same time. And I was down there for, I think, about 8 months. My funds started to run low and I started to get homesick, but it really was what I was looking for. As impulsive and overly romantic as it sounds, that I'll just pick this country based on a little bit of research and move myself there, it turned out to be really what I was looking for. And then I moved to San Francisco and took basically an office job at a .com type company. My sister had moved out there a few years before, so I had an anchor out there. And I just wrote in the margins of life, before work, after work, during my lunch break sometimes, on the weekends, just kind of grinding away at it.
All right. Well, some of the little small commentaries about you and your work suggest that you were just an overnight sensation, young, published. But I understand there were 2 novels that never got published and a mess of short stories.
Absolutely.
The Apprentice work.
Yep.
Went on and on. Things that I noticed that moved through a lot of the fiction. One of them is environmentalism, the outdoors, the Anthropocene extinction period that we're in now. Now, the book for that is
Pride of Eden.
Pride of Eden.
Yep.
And that one is there a wild animal rescue business? Is that it?
There is. Yep. There's an exotic wildlife rescue in it, mainly a big cat sanctuary. The crazy thing is that it came out in 2020, the same week that Tiger King came out, the Netflix documentary that became this huge kind of pop culture sensation. And Pride of Eden looks at it from a very different angle with characters that are really trying to do good work and to help these animals. You know, right. There are more tigers in the state of Texas alone than left in the wild in the rest of the world. I mean, it really is wild. These creatures are out there in people's backyards, and they do get out. And the folks at this sanctuary, especially the main character, Ance Caulfield, takes the idea of wildlife rescue quite literally, I would say.
It is. I am a fan of the elephant. I mean, everybody's got a totem animal, but in a sense, mine is the elephant because they remember everything when we think, and they're big and slow and smart, we think, and I always wonder, the elephant in a zoo or the elephant in a circus, is he feeling bad about things, or are we projecting onto this great big placid animal our own emotional condition? Of course, I don't know They look resigned and unhappy, but what are you going to say? Your interest in the environment runs through several different pieces of fiction, and you have some environmental writers that you care about who have been important to you.
Absolutely. Janice Ray, fellow Georgian, is a really big one. Rick Bass is another one.
Yes.
A lot of Peter Matheson's work, especially on the snow leopard and all that. Definitely, there's a few of them that I come back to them a lot. I think sometimes when we see all the changes that are happening now and go back to what I go back to that well, and it kind of gives me encouragement again, I think.
Well, you and Janice Ray share a custodial interest in the same river, Altamaha.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she's a river keeper, and you have set a novel there. What's special about that one?
It's hard to say. I have all these reasons I can tell you, and I will, but you kind of just have to feel it, I think, when it comes down to it. Like some things that are just so powerful, it's hard for words, but they call it the Amazon of the South, or the Little Amazon sometimes. 137 miles long, crossed by roads only 5 times, all this amazing history on it, all of these endangered creatures on it. We now think that possibly Fort Caroline, the first fortified European settlement in North America, was either on the Altamaha or on the St. Mary's, just a little to the south. For years, everyone thought it was on the St. Johns River in Florida. And it just feels primal in a way that I'm guessing parts of the remote Amazon feels. But you're not that far from civilization, and yet you are. So when you get out there, you feel like you've really gone up, or it feels like Joseph Conrad, right? You've gone up the river, and you're going to find Colonel Kurtz up there. And we have found some things up there that are inspiring for that book.
The thing that popped into my mind, besides Conrad and all of that, was James Dickey and Deliverance. And I was looking to see whether we would go in that direction.
Right.
And there is some of that.
There is a little bit.
There is. You get up. I'm not sure that rural Southerners are all that pleased by Deliverance or other depictions of the rural South as savage.
I agree with that. To be honest, I love James Dickey. I love his poetry. I really enjoy Deliverance, but in the movie and I was surprised. I saw the movie first, like a lot of people, when I was younger, and then I read the book, and I thought that the book would hold back a little more than the movie did about such things, and it doesn't at all. And so I was surprised by it, and I found it a little bit.
Well, he was a Georgia boy, but he was urban. I mean, he was an advertising executive, among other things.
For Coca-Cola, I think, for a long time. You could hear it in his accent, in his voice. You could even hear the kind of...
Absolutely. That book, the River book, and Wingwalkers have structurally they have something very, very much in common, which I found in smaller bits and pieces. You like to construct a book using 2 devices. One device is the journey. In Wingwalkers, it's from east to west. In the river, it's down the river. And the other thing that you like to do is to switch back and forth between time periods and alternate chapters, not necessarily always alternating, but basically you want a journey with 2 different groups of journeyers, travelers, and you want to alter. Why do you want to do that? Why do you want to have 2 stories going side by side on that trip in your book?
It's hard. I've never really set out to do that on purpose, but it's just something that feels natural to me. And I see it sometimes. For The River of Kings, it felt like I had the river, and I had a historical storyline that I knew certain things that had to happen in that storyline. And so then I felt like so it was kind of mapped out before me a little bit, and then the other story could almost braid around it. And I like this idea, and I'm just starting to realize it now, because again, it's not something I set out to do ahead of time, because I don't outline all my books or have them all figured out when I start. But I like the idea of the different viewpoints and even different time periods speaking to each other through the alternating chapters, even though they don't actually touch, or not all the time. They may not touch or cross paths until later in the book.
Well, in the river book, they can't touch because
Exactly,
it's
500 years apart.
500, yeah. But in Wingwalkers, they finally do. What you've got there is, well, there are three characters. There's Zeno, Della, and the dog, Jake, right? The dog.
Sark.
Sark. Cuddy
Yep.
Sark. That's
Yep.
right, not Jake. Sark. And then you have the story. The other narrative is essentially the life of William Faulkner in bits and pieces. Faulkner is not traveling east or west or any other direction, but the young married couple are. Aviation. This is all about the craze for aviation right after World War I, where there had been the first planes, the first dogfights, the first aerial reconnaissance and fighting and bombing and strafing.
Right.
Well, America was crazed for the airplane.
They were, absolutely. And Faulkner was caught up in that too. That was something that really started for me. I saw a photo of him at Square Books in Oxford on the wall, and he's in his uniform, and he's cutting this very rakish figure with a cigarette stuck out of the corner of his mouth and his cane. And that called up stories and anecdotes I remembered from my Faulkner courses when I was reading all the stuff of the tales he would tell of his flying exploits, dubiously. Yeah.
Well, maybe we should recap. Faulkner wanted to become a pilot. He joined the Royal Air Force in Canada, and he went into what was to be pilot training.
Yep, cadet wing.
Cadet wing, went all through the ground school, but
The war ends.
he never flies. When he returned home to Oxford after the war,
Wings on his chest.
he's wearing an officer's uniform and wings. What do you think about that?
I think that and he did more than that. He affected this limp. He said that he'd mess up his leg in this crash and a plate in his
He
head.
said he had a plate in his head.
Yeah, he'd knock his cane or swagger stick against it, and he, can you hear it? Only metal they gave me, I think that there seems something just innocent in it almost to me, as if he couldn't help himself, as if his imagination was just too big for his own life. He wanted it so bad that he had to say that he had experienced it. And he was experiencing it in his mind so much, and he was close, and later in life he did become a pilot. But all of that, his early work has tons of aviation in it. The short stories, of course, Soldier's Pay, Flags in the Dust, /Sartorus, all that. So although it wasn't part of his own life, it quickly made its way into his work.
If you could have, it's always fun to make a historical dinner party, I'd love to ask Ernest Hemingway what he thought about Faulkner with his uniform and his wings.
Right.
But Ernest did something quite similar.
Absolutely.
When he got back to Oak Park, he was wearing the outfit of the Arditi, which is the Italian mountain assault troops, which he had not earned.
Yep.
These people have imagination.
I think they can't. It's almost as if they can't help themselves. And the whole country was involved too. So many people they knew were involved that I think they felt really left out, in a certain way, that they hadn't done the deeds that they'd hoped to do.
Well, Zeno had been and was an ace in France. He survived, although he was grievously burned in World War I. He becomes a pilot. He hooks up with Della. Describe the way you see them up in the air. What are they doing up there?
They're what you would think, what we call
Wing walkers.
barnstorming. Yeah, so Della's a wing walker. Literally, some people may have seen this because it still goes on at air shows today, although today they're typically, strapped in or have a tether. But this was huge from the time right after the war through the 20s and up into the Great Depression, where you could buy, a war surplus biplane trainer for $500, which was a lot of money then, but not for an airplane. And with this flying craze, people wanted to fly. They wanted to see airplanes, and so they would go town to town. They would literally call it barnstorming because you could land at someone's farm, set up an air show, fly it out of the pasture. All these folks would come out. You'd perform all these death-defying stunts, and then they'd pay, to go up and get a ride.
All right, he's flying along, and she climbs out of her cockpit and gets up on the wing, and not only walks around up there, but hangs by her knees There's one little trick in the book, I presume correct, where they have a kid with a hat on the ground. There's a boy holding a hat up in the air. She hangs from the bottom of the plane and
snatches it.
As they,
I have a photo of someone doing it, and they have two boys with their hats doffed and a wing walker on each side of the plane as it flies low to the ground, and they hang from the landing skids, and they're both grabbing the hat at the same time, an old black and white photograph. It was really wild.
Do not sell these people life insurance. I mean, there must have been an endless number of fatalities. I mean, it's obviously suicidal. Her goal, though, is to get from. Do they start in Georgia?
Georgia coast.
And she means to get to Hollywood, whether he ever means to get there or not. The Faulkner, I heard an anecdote years ago. I don't know. When I was a student, Joe Blotner was right down the hall writing the Faulkner biography. And one of the little anecdotes that was that, of course, he didn't know how to fly, but he wanted to learn how, and he had to be kind of sneaky about it. And the anecdote that came to me way back when was that he went to the person who was going to teach him, and he said, it's been a while for me. In your book, he said, I don't know how. The anecdote that came to me years ago was that he told this fella, let's pretend I don't know how. Treat me as you would any student who came in off the street. And they all kind of wink and nod, oh, he really knows how, but this is a refresher course. But anyway, he does learn how. And he flies some. But one of the traumas of Faulkner's life, which is in the book, is the death of he sets up his younger brother.
So after Faulkner, well, first I have to tell you that I met the grandson of Baby Bunton yesterday at Lemuria Books. He came out who taught him to fly at Ole Miss, who he took lessons from. And he had some good kind of stories for me about that. Apparently after about 3 lessons, he said, you're going to kill us both, I can't give you any more. But yes, to your other question. So Faulkner does learn to fly. He buys this Waco biplane, and after flying it for a few years, he gives it as a wedding gift to Dean Swift, his youngest brother. And they had already started doing a barnstorming troupe, an air circus. They called it William Faulkner's. It said William Faulkner's on the handbill, famous author in parentheses, air circus. And then they would, advertise wing walking and parachute jumps and all this. He gives it to Dean, and they changed the name to the Flying Faulkners. And Dean really is kind of running the show. And unfortunately, he's involved in an accident in that airplane.
He dies. And the Faulkner biographers all think that is just an absolute catastrophe, an endless trauma of guilt for William Faulkner. I mean, he gave his younger brother a plane, and they crash.
I think he felt a lot of responsibility for that.
Of course, it's not exactly his fault, but you can see it'll be an emotional mess. Well, anyway, this nice couple who are barnstorming their way west, slowly, may I say, they get to New Orleans, and it's the air show in New Orleans, and at the opening of the airport, I think, out by Lake Pontchartrain. And then they run into Faulkner. The depiction of Faulkner is, did he build a small model plane to try to fly?
He did.
When he was a child?
He did. He did a number of things like this. I think I found this in a memoir from one of his brothers. So all of his brothers all 3 brothers were pilots. But he found plans in a boys magazine, I believe just for scale model. And then he scaled it up using his mother's bean poles and Christmas wrapping paper. They stole a bunch of newspapers and made this kind of egg paste that they, glued down. All apparently somewhat stealthily done so that their mother wouldn't know.
Yeah.
And then Jack was supposed to fly it off the bluff, but young Billy does instead, and they launch it fairly unsuccessfully off of a bluff behind their house.
Of course. This thing, however light they made it, isn't going to fly. Yeah. You'd think maybe Bill would have taken that as a sign, but he didn't.
He took it as the wrong sign.
Right. And you have, as you go through these 2 stories, the Faulkner story, Faulkner has a terrible time in his love life. failure after failure, in a sense. Estelle and then Helen.
Yep.
What?
Even that Mary Elmore, who was teaching him to fly, they ended up getting married. I think that, I don't know what it was, that made it tough for him, but I think that was a lot of his drive too. I think part of the reason he wanted to be a fighter pilot so bad, and when he left Oxford was after, Estelle, his first love, gets engaged to someone else, and so he leaves Oxford to go try to join the RAF and does, and kind of pulls all these stunts to be able to do it, including putting the U in his name, which he was not, born that way. I just met actually Helen's niece, who's still around. Helen, he wrote, this whole book of sonnets for and proposed to, and she turned him down. I think it was tough. He was also small in stature. He was a little guy. I think that probably, that came up.
Well, some of his competitor suitors were great, big, handsome men.
Exactly. And a little bit older, too, it seems like.
Yeah. A little richer, too.
Yeah, absolutely. That comes into it, too. And they were on the way to, a big part of it is he wasn't really taken seriously. And as someone that, is trying to be a writer, I know from my own experience, until you've done it, a lot of people don't believe you're going to be able to, right? So it's not a rocky or smooth road. And so, especially back then when they're thinking about, what the road's going to look like ahead, it didn't look so good, probably.
Would-be writers, there's no big style in being a would-be writer. Well, your book, it should attract. Well, the language is something in a better world we'd read some, but it is Faulknerian language. It is rich, thick, created. New word coinages, neologisms. It really is a remarkable linguistic accomplishment. But you should be able to get readers who are crazed for Faulkner and readers who are crazed for flying. Now we only have less than a minute. You're writing a 6th book or a 7th book.
I guess the 7th grand total. Yes, the next one is historical too, set in West Virginia in 1920s, and deals with an uprising among the coal miners there, among the gun thugs and the coal companies.
Right.
Some really interesting history that one of my good friends is from that area, and some of this kind of hidden, lost history that.
Well, labor history is good stuff. It makes good fiction too. All right, finish the coal mining labor union book. I'll read it. You come back.
I'd love that.
And we sit and talk again.
I'd love that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Don.